Point and Click Productions. Yes, we're back. In association with Portland Mindfulness Therapy, coming at you from Portland, Oregon. And I'm Joe Reinwein, licensed psychologist, with part 2 of, what are we calling what are we calling this? We're calling this, well, the whole shebang is called Buddhism randomly, and then this sub-shebang is called What the Buddha Actually Taught, and then this sub-shebang is called No Self. We're going to talk about the doctrine of no self, and I think that's anatta. Again, I'm not clear. It's either anatta or anicca. We're going to talk about both of them. Anatta, anicca, dukkha. Anatta, I believe, is no self. Correct me if I'm wrong. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Who cares? Anicca, impermanence. Or maybe it's the other way around. And then suffering, dukkha. Dukkha, however it's pronounced. And where we left off, we were discussing, well, what's the self and how did it come to be? Why should it come to be? I was talking about this with my son last night, and he pointed out that before a creature has appendages, it doesn't need as much of a self, because if it's a worm or something, it just keeps eating. And that's interesting, but not exactly substantively changing our thesis. Now, I don't mean to be coy. We're going to get to, in this very video, we're going to get to the issue of, well, as one of my viewers asked, or put it, why I don't exist. So first, though, I think it's important to elaborate a little bit on why would we even want to go in this direction? What was the Buddha getting at? What if the Buddha did not exist, which is immaterial? It really doesn't matter to me whether the Buddha existed or not. The writings exist, the ideas exist, and most importantly, the practices exist. Probably the Buddha was an actual historical figure shrouded in various myths. However, why would we want to even consider our non-existence? I mean, isn't it apparent that we exist? Well, of course we do. So this is not just some kind of game, some kind of silliness. Everything in Buddhism is... Why do I keep saying Buddhism? Because I sound cool. Buddhism! Everything in Buddhism is practical. So once, apparently, there's somewhere in the scriptures, in the Buddhist scriptures, that someone asked the Buddha a series of metaphysical questions. Does God exist? What happens after we die? And so forth. And the Buddha answered something like this. You are like someone who comes to me with an arrow in your chest, having just been shot, asking me, now before you remove this arrow and heal my wound, can you please tell me at what velocity was it traveling when it hit me? What is the arrow made out of? And what sort of arrowhead do you suppose might be embedded in my chest at this moment? Instead of that, the Buddha recommends, why don't we take the arrow out and heal your wound? So Buddhism is not about metaphysics. It's not about reality, per se. It is and it isn't, like so many things in Buddhism, especially from the standpoint of Zen, which is where my training in Buddhism comes from. The Chinese, Japanese, American tradition, now we'll add American tradition of Zen, get into that another time, tends to emphasize the antinomies, the dualities, the opposites that seem contradictory but aren't. So why would you want to consider in what way you do not exist when you obviously do? Well, as I started saying, there are any number of times when our ego, as we put it, gets in the way. So the self has something to do with needing to take things in and needing to push things away. I want this, I don't want that. And every organism of a given complexity, let's say at least from the level of lizards and mammals and other recognizable animal life forms, needs to have a self-representation of some sort. And that's fine. We need that. Without that, we just sit there and go, or not even that. We wouldn't feed ourselves. We would just die. There'd be no survival of the genes. They wouldn't get passed down. So we have these genes for forming a self-concept, and our brain is ready to form that. Why would we consider not weakening that, let's say? Why would we consider the other side of things, that in some senses we don't exist? Well, we all know what the outcome is of a big ego, right? When we take ourself too seriously, we think that there's something in here. It's like we have we imagine that there's some kind of center to me, and I've got to defend that. Okay, so if you insult me in some way, if I perceive an insult, well, now I gotta really hit back, right? Maybe not. Because now that we're linguistic creatures, as I've talked about endlessly in my old videos back from 2013 through 2015, we think symbolically. So most of the threats that face us, they're not threats that are going to kill us. They're threats to the ego, the sense of having a self to defend. So if we pretend that this little orange and blue ball that I found in Lake Oswego here and cleaned up and brought home because I thought, well, this is a nifty little thing to use. It can go into my dodecahedron of many things. Let's pretend that this is the thing that I think is in me that I have to defend. So this treasured, my precious, you can see what a geek I am with all these references to fantasy, this treasured, precious thing I must defend against all insults, and I must fight back. And in some cases, maybe that could be useful, and in many cases, it's really not. I mean, if you're trying to have a marriage, and every time you have a perceived insult, you have to hit the other a few times in the face, metaphorically speaking, hopefully not literally, you're going to have problems in your marriage. If you need to be right all the time, for instance, to defend your fragile sense of existence, to defend a very tender and easily wounded self, you're going to have some problems. That's pretty clear. So we're talking about psychological problems. The Buddha was a psychologist above all. He wasn't interested in if he was interested in what truly existed, it's not mostly what he talked about. Mostly he was a philosopher and a psychologist, and I consider psychology to be a branch of philosophy, really. So having chewed through 8 minutes of your time working up at least some sort of argument of why you might want to consider that there might not be a center to you that you have to defend at all costs. Now let's look at it a little bit differently. Let's look at it from the following angle. We take a thing, okay? How about a pen? This is very thingish. It makes a noise, all right? If we look at the pen really, really closely, we see that it is made of non-pen parts. In fact, it is easily disassembled into a few parts that are no longer recognizably pen. And if we kept going, we could disassemble it into more parts. Now, luckily for me, this is my favorite pen, the Pilot G2. I'm not getting any money from Pilot. I wish I were. It's not made out of a billion tiny pens, right? That's not how this works. Everything is made out of what it isn't. That's not a mystical Asian contradiction. It's just fact, and obvious fact. This is not made out of a trillion tiny pens. We know what it's made out of. It's made out of molecules. The plastic happens to be a polymer, and so forth, but it's made out of things that aren't pens. That's just obvious. If we look at my hand, it's going to be made in the end out of complex molecules, mostly composed of atoms of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and then some trace elements. So a hand is not made out of a billion tiny hands, nor does a hand have a tiny little hand in the middle being the uber hand that has control over the hand. Well, that's true of me too. I'm not made out of a trillion tiny little Joes with one uber Joe somewhere located up here pulling the levers. Yeah, that would promote an infinite regress. Because then if we ask what's the uber Joe, what's the homunculus made out of? It's made out of more homunculuses, and it's homunculuses all the way down. It's not scientific thinking. I am made out of what I am not. I am not a bunch of organs, for instance. I don't think of myself as a pile of sloppy, slimy organs, spleens, and intestines, and brains, and nerve fibers. Obviously, that's what's in me, and that composes me, but that's not what I am in any experiential way. I've never seen any of those things. Thank God. Maybe I've seen a couple in very blurry images on an x-ray, but I'm not made out of a trillion tiny little Joes. I'm made out of those weird things that I am not. Do we start to get a little bit of a flavor here of where we're going? Let's consider this from another angle, just a purely experiential angle, if you will. And I'm going to try not to cough. I've got my iced coffee. If we look at anything, I don't know, let's see, well, what have I got around here? I've got a number of different objects we could look at. It's a little boring, but we'll look at another pen, we'll look at a marker. If we look at a marker long enough, if we stare at an object long enough, it starts to look weird. It's just like if, sometimes, usually in childhood, we discover that if you say a word enough times, it starts to sound weird. The ACT people like to use the example of milk. Milk, 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 milk. If you say milk enough times, it doesn't sound like milk anymore. It sounds like what it's made out of. Milk. And it loses its milkiness, for lack of better terminology. The same thing if you stare at something long enough, it will start to lose its markerishness. And we start to notice its composite parts, and the whole thing gets a little surreal. Well, guess what happens if we look at ourselves for hours and hours and hours, just like we do in extended meditation, just like in the myth the Buddha did under the Bodhi tree. He was looking at himself and looking at himself and looking at himself and looking at himself and looking at himself. But not in a brainy kind of, I wonder what kind of person I am. Let me analyze what happened when I was a kid. I mean, there may have been some of that in there, but mostly the practice that he recommends is not that. Mostly the practice is feeling the body with the body. And in the specific case of Shakyamuni Buddha, his method was following the breath. We use that method, we use many others, they all work well. But following the breath and embodying the body, feeling the body with the body. What do we mean by that? Proprioception, feeling your hands, feeling your feet, feeling the body as a whole. And as our mindfulness strengthens, we can feel more and more at the same time without getting too confused or distracted. The more we look at it, the more it is not what we thought it was. Ultimately, we see that it has no center. There's no one place where I am. And strangely, over time, we start to see that it's just a bunch of sense data. The Buddha was not the only one to recognize this. I believe it was either David Hume or John Stuart Mill, one of these kind of somewhere around the 18th century. I'm not good with this stuff, folks, but I reviewed it briefly in college and moved on. But one of our philosophers, and I think it was an English or Scottish philosopher, said, when they look inward, it might have been William James at the end of the 19th century, turned to the 20th century. Might have been William James. In any case, one of those guys, one of those dead white males, said, actually, all I find when I look inward is a bundle of sense data. All I find is seeing, smelling, hearing, touching, tasting, and then what we call feeling or proprioception, a whole bunch of other bodily sensations, sense of thirst and so forth, loosely bound together. And the strange thing about that is that means, and we discover this experientially, we don't really discover this in a useful way by talking about it. You have to actually sit down and do the work to get the benefit. But this is all just to kind of, I don't know, maybe pave the way a little bit or provide a rationale or just satisfy people's curiosity of what is all this stuff about. So what we start to see when we look deeply and persistently, hour after hour after hour, and we get up and we, in ritualized Zen practice, we get up at least every hour to walk in circles, and then every couple hours we take a break and we go have something to eat, because we're not asceticists. We're not like the people the Buddha encountered in the story of the Buddha I told in the first video in this mega series. We're not like the people who starve ourselves or whip ourselves or any of that kind of stuff. We take care of the body. It's called the Buddha called it the middle way. We try not to overindulge, and then we also don't deprive ourselves of what we need. I'm a little bit all over the place today, but pulling it back together, what we see is that we're just aggregates. We're just aggregates, and actually the boundary between I, me, mine, the stuff that we call the I, the me, the mine, as the Beatles so eloquently put it, it starts to dissolve. Because after all, what I see and what I hear, I think of as outside of myself for the most part. And that boundary between myself and what's not me starts to get fuzzy, and maybe even in some cases temporarily dissolve. And if we keep going, things get very interesting indeed. This video is long enough at this point. It's getting a little psychedelic. We're getting a little out there. But the purpose of this dissolution of self, don't worry, it's not permanent. People panic. I've certainly panicked when doing this. People panic, but the ego's going to reconstitute itself. We need the ego. But a temporary dissolution of the ego is not psychosis, hopefully. If you've sat for hour upon hour and your life is more or less together, you're not going crazy, and you're not dying. Turn off your mind and float downstream. It is not dying. The Beatles quoting Timothy Leary and co. In their translation or their riffing off of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This is a process that allows us to see something that's hard to see in everyday life. And once we've seen that, we don't need to dwell there very long. We will reconstitute naturally. We'll just get it. The bell will ring, or the retreat will end, the 7-day retreat will end, or the 10-day Vipassana retreat will end, and we'll get up and we'll go home, but things will look a little different. And maybe we'll be a little less selfish, and maybe we'll have a little bit of a smaller sense of ego that's not quite as real and doesn't motivate us to do so many unskillful things, like fight at every opportunity, or passive-aggressively fight in every opportunity, or sink into a depression in the face of any adversity. So this is a psychological healing process. This is a way of living well. This is not about ontology. It's not about what exists and what doesn't exist. Experientially, we clearly exist. But experientially, there are times and places, particularly if we've worked very hard at it in meditation, when we can see the way in which we don't quite exist, at least not the way we thought we did, as a hard, solid thing that is a thing unto itself. There is no thing in itself, it turns out, if we look really carefully at anything. So I hope this video has, maybe in a random kind of way, and I did promise Buddhism randomly, maybe this video has kind of given you at least a little flavor of what Buddhists mean by empty of self-nature, what Buddhists mean by no self, non-self, or the non-existence of self. And maybe I'll do a little bit of an epilogue after this video, or maybe I'll just move on to the next issue and not dwell on it. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. Bye-bye.